course, we're looking at assessment types and design. Before we do that, let's have a little bit of a look at something that's quite interesting. It's relatively intuitive, and we've seen these sorts of things before about what people remember. So people remember what they read, that's very low down on the list, and they remember more of what they actually do. Makes good sense, a bit of evidence to support that. And there's this link along the side here which is quite interesting. So they've actually defined here, Van Dam has defined this e-reading as being the low end of things, and what we call e-learning is sort of a graduating scale leading up to really high levels of e-learning. And underneath that there's also the level of instructional design, which ranges from low to high. So down at the low end we get things like email, e-documents, the sorts of stuff that we see every single day in our inboxes. Relatively passive stuff. We read what we need to read, we digest what we need to do that, and we file the rest of it appropriately. As we move along, we see that there's online PowerPoint presentations, some pre-recorded audio and video, interactive classes, getting right up to simulations and games, virtual worlds, that sort of stuff, as well as role-playing scenarios. So a wide variety of stuff, even at that high level. It's worth remembering, or at least thinking about the amount of effort that's required to create these things. I think it matches a scale that's like this one on the bottom about the level of instructional design. The amount of effort and the amount of time and resources that you need to allocate towards these things is at the low end for low capability resources, right up to the very high end. Lots of time to create things like role-playing scenarios, virtual worlds and gaming situations for your students to engage with. So the more interactivity, the more effort, the more instructional design required, the more the learning is possibly going to be. Worth keeping in the back of your head. Okay, so we use assessment for a number of things. We often talk about formative and summative assessments. Formative assessment being assessment for learning, summative assessment being assessment of learning. So typically in the old days, I guess, the summative assessment would have been end of term exam or end of topic examination. We tend to combine our formative and summative assessments much more now. So the idea being that instead of the summative assessment being the end of learning of a particular area, we actually have some summative assessments which lead to greater learning and feed into later assessments. So there's a formative side to it, and feedback plays a very important part in that. Diagnostic assessments, they just give you a bit of a chance to assess the capabilities of your students, identify a few misconceptions. So some classroom quizzes can do that, or even a more rigorous testing of what the students know. It may govern how you choose to teach and what you choose to teach, and possibly what you might choose to assess. A bit tricky to do that on the fly, but it has been done. So what makes a good assessment? Well, Gibbs and co suggest that there's a number of things here, and I think the important thing to note down here is that the majority of these relate to feedback. Certainly the tasks have to be meaningful, they have to capture enough time, student effort, and it's evenly distributed. This is something that's considered to be a key attribute of good assessment. The learning that's gained from the assessments has to be productive and meaningful. And it should be clear. The assessment should be clear and should actually raise the expectations of the students to a decent level. Lots of students don't like easy assignments. They're there for a bit of a challenge and to learn something. So assessments that are trivial are not well respected by the students, and obviously don't tell us too much about what the student body is and do not necessarily prepare them for the future. In terms of feedback, sufficient feedback is required and quickly enough to be useful to students. That's going to depend on how your course is structured, how feedback might feed forward into other assignments, but typically feedback that's provided more than a couple of weeks late is likely to not have a massive learning impact on students. And if we're going to a lot of the trouble of writing the feedback, we really would like the students to be paying some attention to it. The idea that it focuses on learning is something that we can direct to some extent, although the students' focus is always going to be on the marks to start with, and then they'll think about what it is that they need to do to improve things, especially if the assignment feeds into other stuff in the future. The feedback needs to be meaningful, understandable, and ideally the students should be able to actually act upon the feedback and improve their work and their learning. Okay. The model for feedback is pretty basic. So this is for formative assessment. A student may or may not have some standards and exemplars to work with. Before they do their assessment, they'll do their assessment tasks. The teacher, or perhaps a piece of technology, might mark that assessment, provide some feedback to the student, who may then choose to revisit the formative assessment or feed forward into other assessments moving forwards. In some summative assessments, like final exams, this feedback path might not be there, but often there are standards and previous examination papers, previous advice from students, and of course information from the teachers. Very simple model, but very clear. Good feedback practices, Nicole Milligan. They're looking at being positive about the feedback. It can be tricky at times, but certainly a positive approach to feedback, finding some things that are good in students' work, is always a better approach than just damning everything that they've done. In the end, a positive spark might inspire greater work in the future. The idea, of course, is to close the gap between the ideal performance of the student and their current performance. So the feedback is designed to fill that gap. And if the students act on it, then hopefully they can improve their performance. It's also important from our perspective that we can actually look at some of the information that we're giving back to the students and identify common misconceptions, common problems that the students have, and that can help redefine our teaching as well. If we get the chance to reflect on it, it can take a little time to do that. There's plenty of reasons to provide feedback. I'm not going to go into it too much here, but basically any feedback enhances positive effects of assignments that we do. Even when students guess, the feedback can guide them to a better outcome in the future. It has strong links to retention of information, skills, etc. Many of you will have seen Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom was a person in the 1950s who considered learning from a number of different domains. One of them was the cognitive domain, and he considered the cognitive levels required to complete certain tasks. Right at the very bottom here is the knowledge level. So that's basically a baseline for students, or anyone really, to understand some of the basics. So in maths it might just be how to add simple numbers. Understanding might be a little more elaborate. It might be understanding how to apply some basic mathematical operations to multiplication, for example. Application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. There are many, many words which are associated with these different aspects of Bloom's taxonomy, and it's not necessarily always a pyramid. There can be activity going on here that isn't directly related to the base information, but commonly people tend to think of it as a growing pyramid and a growing capability in cognitive skills. So some of the words that come out here: knowledge, defining, duplicating, listing, memorizing. You get down to analysis, and analyze, not surprisingly, is a word there. Calculate, categorize, compare and contrast. Evaluation, right up the top there. You're looking at defending positions, judging outcomes, judging situations, predicting events, supporting particular positions. So you can see that there's quite a significant change in cognitive skill required from the knowledge level to the evaluation level. Bloom's taxonomy is not the only form that's like this. There's the more modern version of Bloom's taxonomy, changing the wording, remembering, understanding, and there's a change at the top. So analysing, evaluating, and then there's creating sitting at the top there. This is more commonly used than the older version these days. There's John Biggs invented the structure of the observed learning outcomes. And this, whereas Bloom's is more about cognitive domain for people, Solo is typically focused towards assessment and learning outcomes. The wording is difficult and not necessarily as intuitive as Bloom's taxonomy, but I introduce it here just so that you're aware of it. Pre-structural, unistructural, multi-structural, relational, and extended abstract are the terminologies used here. So pre-structural is I'm not sure about many things. Unistructural, there might be a relevant idea related to a particular issue. Multi-structural is several ideas. Relational gathers those ideas together and can link them together. And an extended abstract can do all of that, but then look at things in a new and different way. So that's solo. In brief, we could say that solo could be encapsulated here. So at first we pick up only one or a few aspects of a particular task, that's unistructural. Then several aspects, but they're unrelated, multistructural. Then we finally learn how to integrate them into a whole, relational. And finally, at the very end, we're able to generalize that whole to an as yet untaught application. So that's the extended abstract. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. Bloom's, I think, is much more intuitive for people, and I'm going to proceed with that. Other models around, and there are many of them. Miller's model is very simple. Model of competence. Knows how, shows how, and does. Once again, makes good intuitive sense, and for practical skills, actually has a fairly logical application. And the use of all of these can be very useful for helping to define your assessments, where they fit in, what level you're addressing some of the learning outcomes at, and how the students can demonstrate their skills or their ability to comprehend some of the things that you're teaching. Okay, you can look at these movies if you want. These are typical tasks that I encourage students to do. Look at a couple of movies, and then try and write some questions assessing different levels. It's very easy down at the knowledge level. It gets very hard down at the in this middle area really. Creation is not too hard. Okay, so in a particular situation, you might try and list as many assessment types as you can think of, and it's a good way to start planning how your assessments are going to go. Think about what you've got in your armoury and how well you can do them, and some of the resources required to carry them off. So there are a bundle of different kinds. There's selected response questions. So these are typically your multiple choice questions, extended matching questions, general matching questions, and ranking questions. Hotspots, all those sorts of things where the student isn't actually required to construct an answer. They choose an answer from something that's provided on the screen. So there is an element of queuing involved there. Then there's the constructed response questions, and you'll be familiar with essays, reports, short answer questions, presentations of varying natures, so that could be oral presentations or videos, a whole bunch of things there. And then there are probably things that are not used all that often as yet, but are becoming more so. Things that include portfolios, journals. You could possibly include discussion forums in here, or maybe under constructed response questions. But these are a newer form of assignments and assessments that we are not fully up to speed with at the moment, but certainly they are looking to be very, very useful for assessing many, many different things. How good are our methods? Van der Vleuten defines the utility of an assessment as a product of its reliability, validity, cost effectiveness, acceptability, and educational impact. So acceptability to the target audience. It's obviously an equation that's not readily solved. If you can measure educational impact in any sort of repeatable way, you'd be doing very, very well. But there are the terminology and the thoughts behind all this are of some use. So let's, for example, consider a group of doctors. We want them to be able to demonstrate their learning in an emergency situation. So you could assess them in basically a choose one right answer type approach. So this is a selected response question. In an emergency, what is the most important aspect of treating injured casualties? And there's a choice there of 4 things, one of which will get the marks. Here, this is very reliable. It's going to probably give the same answers over and over again if the student were to keep sitting this particular question. Is it valid? Well, it tells a little iota about what the student understands in emergency situations, but it doesn't really cover too many things. And most clinicians, most emergency people will probably say, this isn't really a great way for us to decide if someone knows how to manage an emergency situation. Very cost effective. This can be automated and marked automatically and sent back to the students, and is probably quite acceptable from the student point of view. It's clearly understood, it's relatively easily managed, and it's likely to be quite successful for them, which is always useful. So I would suggest that the educational impact there is light. You could just open this up. So a short answer question, 20 or 30 words would probably answer that. It's more valid because the student needs to consider some of these aspects of this situation without any cueing whatsoever from choices. It's not as cost effective because of the fact that it can't necessarily be marked automatically. There are probably ways you could do something relatively simple like this. It's probably not quite as acceptable to students because it's a bit harder. It might not be as acceptable to your assessment board or your the rest of the school that you work in, because it's maybe not testing enough for them. So just the acceptability really depends on who is looking at the question and on what their context is. Here's a different situation. In an emergency, what is the most important issues to be considered? Post at least 3 entries into a discussion board. Ensure you respond to 1 post in detail. This is really getting into some of the nitty-gritty and certainly some of the discussion aspects, some of the chance for students to reflect on something, post entries, and then think about what other people are saying and then respond to those. Makes this relatively powerful. It's problematic to mark. There's no doubt about that, so its cost effectiveness goes down. It's subjective to mark, so its reliability is probably not as high as a multiple choice question. But in terms of educational impact, it certainly has some validity there. You might choose to devise this as a group work exercise. Work with the group, devise a strategy on how to handle an emergency situation, put it into a wiki. So we're talking about some of the online tools now, and then present that in class. So there's a group work activity here. There is a reporting activity, which is the wiki, and then there's a presentation side of it as well. Quite powerful educationally, probably quite valid, maybe or maybe not acceptable to the students. Cost effective, definitely not. Problematic. There's lots of things to mark in this particular situation here. And there's group work to set up, which is always a little bit tricky, but nonetheless it has different attributes to some of the other assessment types we've seen. You might choose to do something really quite radical and set up a role-playing scenario in an emergency ward, and everyone has different roles that they have to play out. Very costly, very expensive. What is all of its educational impact or reliability, validity? All of those things will probably vary to some extent. I would suggest that this has relatively high educational impact. It allows students to consider different perspectives in an emergency ward, some of which may not be entirely palatable with their particular personal preferences. Its reliability, it's subjective. Someone's got to mark this somehow with a rubric, no doubt. Makes it quite challenging. It's quite valid. Its context is relatively solid, but it's not going to be too cheap put together, although in the scheme of things, it's not too expensive. If you're looking for expensive, then the following scenario certainly fits into that. Setting up a virtual world and getting people to behave as doctors and interact with people online to try and solve problems. This is certainly nothing I would recommend. If you recall the slides shown right at the very beginning, this is high instructional design requirements. It certainly has massive resource and time implications, and certainly from my perspective, unless this is done as a very, very large scale approach, maybe school-wide, it is certainly not worth the effort and certainly not worth it from the learning that the students are likely to gain. There's much better ways we could spend our time. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to some of the assessment types. We're going to have a look at how we might test our assessments, see how effective they are. We'll have a look and seeing about some of the errors that we can make, well, we shouldn't make, but we often make with some of our assessment types. It's usually to do with wording, but we'll do that next time.